That is Jordan Felice on the panel with Glorify. Now, Andrew Urquhart and, a new co-host on the panel today, Liana Cooper. Kia ora, good morning. How are you?
Kia ora, kei te pai aho. I'm feeling good about being a part of the panel.
Well,
Thank you for having me.
It seems bad because I feel like I'm inviting you to your own whare. We're carrying you onto your own marae, as it were. I mean, this is home for you, and I'm the guest, really. That's fair enough, isn't it?
No, I feel like a guest because you're doing all the hard work over there on the desk and I'm just sitting back and relaxing.
Well, you are our Eloise Packham substitute. She had a much better offer than doing the panel, getting married this Friday. So, yeah, thanks for stepping up.
No worries.
It's kind of like bridesmaid duties, isn't it? that sort of thing.
Exactly.
Now, today on the panel, over the last 6 weeks, in fact, we've looked at a range of topics that people are passionate about and that influence their way of seeing the world, including their political views. We've covered such topics as economic recovery, environmental concerns, a Māori perspective, addiction and legalisation, and also caring for all at the end of their lives. And finally today, the topic is faith, giving a reason for the hope that we have, not just in heaven, but here and now in Aotearoa. What that might look like from a political perspective, and as we look through to the future through the lens of faith, hope and love. Now, my panellists today, my pleasure to welcome Chris Clarke. He is former CEO of World Vision, but hey, after such a solid experience there, what do you do for an encore? Now, an advisor to the Wilberforce Foundation. Chris, kia ora, thank you for joining us today.
All right, Andrew. Hello, Liana.
Morena.
So, Wilberforce Foundation, unpack that a little bit. What does your role involve there?
So it's a wonderful team of people, a very small team of people. We work with about 60 faith-based charities, many of them well-known names across New Zealand, Christian Against Poverty, VisionWest and other organisations, trying to support them do their work well. Now, that includes finance, funding, but it goes a lot further than that. It's about leadership development and also particularly the whole issue of how do Christians engage with public policy and engage in issues such as politics.
Well, I'm glad you invited you to the panel. You sound like you're the man for the job.
Perfect.
Speaking of VisionWest and leadership as well, now we were hoping to have the CEO of VisionWest, Lisa Woolley, here, although delegation is such a great sign of leadership. Welcoming Head of Service Development and Partnerships, Brook Turner. Brook, kia ora, good morning. Thank you for your time today.
Good morning. Just hoping I can do a little bit better than Damien McKenzie did in the weekend.
Well,
as the ring-in, but
well,
great to be here.
exactly. No, I'm confident. Gosh, I hope that doesn't bode badly for what's about to happen next. No, but I'm confident it'll go very well. Unpack a little bit the whole idea of VisionWest Community Trust. What sort of things are you guys involved with?
Well, VisionWest is really about ending homelessness, reducing inequality and poverty in Aotearoa, and we have a range of social services that are driven from a faith-led ethic. Mm-hmm. So really driven from what God's calling us to do as an organisation and a commitment to seeing a more equitable and equal New Zealand, and particularly a New Zealand that embraces the ideas of social justice and the social justice parts of the scriptures that we read and love.
And also welcoming, the man that needs no introduction, the Reverend Frank Ritchie, now a regular contributor to this and other programs. Frank, in fact, I think you are more on our radio stations now than you were when you used to work for us full time. Honestly,
it's probably true.
Yeah, exactly. But always value your contribution. Of course, many different hats. But in this instance, as a media chaplain and your engagement with journalists and media, particularly around this political process.
Yeah, I've done some research. I love the fact that I'm sitting here, and research shows that the least trusted people in society now are political leaders, religious leaders, media personnel.
Great
I'm here
company,
to talk
guys.
Politics. I'm a church leader and I work in the media.
Yeah.
So in terms of trusting what I've got to say today,
it's all up from here,
probably
right?
Some good questions to be asked.
Yeah, exactly. Now, we certainly look forward to hearing more from the panellists, but also from the people watching the live stream. Now, Liana, the live stream underway. We've got a few people that are watching already, that's right?
Yes, we've got a few people watching, so thank you. And yeah, my job today is to invite you to ask questions. That's what it's all about. Faith and politics is the topic, and you can go to both the Facebook pages across Life FM and Rima, or on our YouTube channels as well. Yes, we're streaming this live, which means we'll get your questions straight away, so feel free to get in touch. The first, it's more of a comment, is just loving the pink jacket.
Oh, wow.
So that's as far as we've got on those pages so far.
I'm getting a lot of love for this pink jacket. And isn't it Pink Shirt Day on Friday. So
yeah,
I'm ahead of my time, as always. Looking forward to more from the panel and your comments as well. It's coming up in just a moment. Okay, for the people watching the live stream, welcome along. You get to see behind the scenes as well what these guys get up to when they think the cameras aren't looking. So look, if there's any questions that you'd like to fire in now, that's very good. Comments on the jacket. I mean, these guys have also made an effort, so don't leave them hanging in that regard. Or if you've got questions on the actual faith and politics thing, send them through to Liana and. Rocking that leather jacket, by the way, if you're feeling missed out.
Thank you. I did feel I had to dress up for this occasion. Also, Chris, is that velvet, your jacket?
It's velvet. I'm glad you noticed. It's cool,
far
isn't it?
out.
Do you want to touch
Yes,
it?
yes,
It's very.
Yeah.
It's level 1. We can do that now,
That's
Chris.
great.
Not quite your standard with the
Well,
pink jacket, but
no.
I aspire.
No, you rock a good velvet jacket, Chris. That's absolutely fine.
Beautiful.
Imagine if you could get pink velvet.
Oh, yeah.
I think you can.
Good combo.
I think that's more of a specialty shop thing, though, isn't it? Yeah, exactly. So we are just in commercial break at the moment. We have a minute and a half to go until we're back live. So they're just short little breaks and then we jump into it. As we come back from the break, Chris, you're getting the first question. And, just going to keep you in suspense for an extra minute.
That's great.
But you'll be fine.
Talking about rhododendrons.
Rhododendrons.
The key
Exactly.
thing is the acid fertiliser. If
Yeah.
you haven't done it by now, it's too late.
Yeah. And do you have velvet gloves to match your jacket for the gardening? I don't know. Well, we may get to that.
I'm not a skinny millennial, mate.
Exactly.
I'm a skinny in Gen X.
Okay, we are now, about just under a minute until we are live. People commenting. Oh, look, we've got some fans. Look at that. We got... We brought our own fans. There's people through the window for the folks at home. We've got a tour party happening at the moment. Should get one of them in on the panel just as an impromptu guest. What do you think? That'll be good, right?
It's pretty hard to pull someone in when you're just live and you're recording.
Yeah,
behind
but
the
you
scenes
get the
stuff,
best results, don't you? Okay, we are coming up just under 30 seconds from live. I will switch our microphones back to live, and then the people in Radio Land and TV can join the behind-the-scenes special conversation just for you guys on the live stream coming up. You are listening to the panel on the topic of faith and politics, the combination of that. We had some guests walk past the studio. Liana, I was saying in the break, maybe we should rope them in, get them as sort of vox pops on the street, what the people are thinking out there. But we're doing that through social media at the moment, right?
Exactly, we are. And you can share your thoughts and comments and obviously your questions to our experts today. So you can do that over our Facebook pages on Life FM or Rema. And we welcome you to do that. That's what this is all about. And we're talking faith and politics today.
Chris, just kicking off with this question. I've had a lot of conversations on the topic of, is New Zealand a secular society? And according to your view, your research on this, what would you say to that?
So we did some research about 18 months ago. What we found is that New Zealand divides itself into roughly thirds. Mm-hmm. A third of people who have absolutely no spirituality at all, or faith tradition, Christian or other. A third that identify with a faith tradition other than Christianity. And then a third who would identify themselves as being Christian. Now, that only tells you a little bit. We asked some more questions about that. And of that, about 9% of New Zealanders attend a church regularly. So quite a minority. So 9 out of 10 people don't attend a church, yep. 1 out of 10 do, but still a very sizable minority in New Zealand.
Frank, if I can bring you on this one and perhaps take a different perspective, we're not necessarily talking majority rule. A third doesn't get you much, although perhaps as a coalition partner. But when we talk foundational worldview, what I suppose makes up the psyche of the average New Zealander, surely there's Christian Judeo roots. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, I think obviously it's had a big influence in New Zealand. I mean, when our parliament first met, the first thing that they voted on was the Speaker of the House. The second thing they voted on was whether or not they should open parliament to pray. Yep. And we've had prayer in parliament ever since. So obviously there's elements of it there. I would say our nation now is largely secular humanist, but that is heavily influenced when you look at the understandings around compassion and justice. That's heavily influenced by the Christian worldview that has informed it, that's come before it.
Of course, there's not just one Christian worldview. That's why we have denominations, right? And Brook, your comments on this one, maybe this depends on whether your Christian perspective looks more like taking a moral stand on ethical issues or serving the poor and the marginalised like you do through VisionWest.
Yeah, I think there's a real strong compassion amongst New Zealanders to give to causes they believe in, and I think that speaks to a belief that we all have in New Zealand, that this is our Aotearoa, that we want a egalitarian society, that we don't want our kids to be left behind. And I think for many people, you know, when you do get into that conversation with them over coffee at a cafe, there is something that we would term as spiritual driving their belief system or their behaviours. And certainly we see that with the people that we work with. As I often say, I've never met a homeless person who doesn't believe in God because of their experiences on the streets.
And I suppose even that compassion, that looking out for your fellow man, of wanting to do the best, there's kind of Christian roots to that, or am I being naive, open to the panel?
Yeah, I mean, the Christian idea that every single person is created in the image of God, therefore every single person is worthy of dignity and respect and worth and is there to be valued. I think that's informing a lot of what's there at the moment. People have often just disconnected God from that, but as has been pointed out, most people now still carry a spirituality. In my media work, when I sit down with people, there are spiritual conversations that come up all the time. Yeah. I often have my clerical collar on, so it says that we're here for a certain type of conversation if you want to have it. The amount of times that gets raised is phenomenal.
The way in which society views Christianity, though, may be very different than the way we as Christians see our place in society. And Chris, I know you've done some more research on this. They know what we hate more than what we love. It's more about what we're against than what we're for in terms of the way in which society views Christianity.
Yeah, that's the bad news from the survey results. So the good news is that 1 in 4 New Zealanders, is picking really up on what Brook and Frank are saying, are actually really interested in a conversation about spirituality. So it's not that they're closed to it. They want to have a conversation, but they want to be treated respectfully. So when you ask those 1 in 4, so why aren't you having that conversation? The reason they're not having the conversation, sadly, is because of Christians. They're saying we don't like the positions you're adopting on certain issues, and we don't like the posture that you're adopting on certain issues. So positions on issues particularly around sexuality, because that's been in the news very much recently. The fact that much of our faith seems to be very privatised, and we say very little about the bigger issues of public policy or the environment. And then our posture, in the sense that we come across as hectoring and we come across as lacking intelligence and not willing to engage or listen to communities. So the challenge for us as people of faith who follow Jesus Christ is that we are the ones that in many ways are stopping that conversation happening.
Also, perhaps an issue of trust. And Brook, your comments on this, I suppose faith is what motivates you to do what you do, but loving people unconditionally without an agenda, not saying, hey, we'll help this homeless person, but we'll try and get them to church.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think that you need to put a bumper sticker for God on the sun to know that he created it, you know, or on the totara tree, you know, but sometimes as Christians, I think we're trying to label God's work. God doesn't need his work to be labelled. You know, it's there for all to see. As the Franciscans said, you know, the first Bible is creation. Yeah. And so actually when we resonate with what creation is called to be, an ecosystem that works in harmony with one another and hopefully humanity as well, God is glorified.
Well, bringing in our resident Franciscan, Frank, I hope you don't mind being called that. But your experience with the media, I would say sometimes a little bit of cynicism is actually a ministry gift in media. You need to have that sort of inquiring mind. But generally, do you think that faith is misrepresented or just misunderstood by the media?
I'd very quickly say misunderstood. I think because Christians have often seen the media as the enemy, we've approached them as such. And so a lot of media people, their only engagement with faith is when Christians, church leaders or church members do something really dumb and it becomes a worthy news story. Yep. Or the complaints that they get via email. That's it. So the chance to sit down with someone someone like myself and just have a normal conversation about spirituality is very rich. And often I get asked questions that you'd expect in a Sunday school class, and it's because it's the first time they've had the opportunity to explore. So I now get calls from some journalists when they want to talk or do a story about faith, just to help explain things and help them understand things a little better. It's misunderstanding and it's naivety. And if the only way we're engaging with the culture is through hostility and trying to gain power, it's no wonder that we wouldn't be listened to and people wouldn't want that conversation.
Difficult to have a sphere of influence or even a seat at the table politically when there is so much misrepresentation, misunderstanding, and perhaps lack of trust between society and people of faith. Chris, any comments on that?
Yeah, well, I think this is the reason I'm actually a great fan of secularism, which might sound a sort of strange thing to say, but a full understanding of secularism says that all voices are invited to the table.
Yes.
And clearly the posture we need to adopt as Christians is that we're not the only voice. When we presume that, that's when we're accused of being hectoring and not listening. But if we accept the fact that we have a place at the table, but we earn that place in the table, and how do we earn that place at the table? We earn it through the kind of work that happens through VisionWest, actually by showing love and compassion and care for people. That earns the right to be a part of the conversation. We certainly don't earn it by the fact of saying that we're a Christian nation or that we've got God on our side or things like that. We'll be immediately dismissed. So we have to be much more nuanced in terms of how we embrace secularism and embrace the fact that as part of a secular economy and a secular society, there is a place for an intelligent Christian voice.
And much easier to have a conversation where there's a relationship of trust and mutual appreciation, right?
Well, Frank's a great example of that. When I think about the work that Christian Broadcasting Association are doing and media chaplaincy, it didn't happen overnight. It was because of the relationships that were built. I think Christchurch, in your experience in Christchurch, of actually being there, following the mosque shooting, getting alongside those journalists, not to get a story, but just to offer them support. And they're some of the people who now come to you and talk to you on a pretty well daily basis.
Yeah, and I could imagine some listeners listening to this and going, but what about when they do this?
Yep.
Whether it be the media or anybody else, politicians. What about when they treat Christians badly? What about when they do this to us? And that self-defensive posture comes up. My response to that would be, it doesn't matter. We follow the one who hung on a cross, who went through an unjust trial. Like the injustices committed against him were phenomenal. Yet he hung on that cross and asked for the forgiveness of the ones who put him there.
If we're followers of Jesus, it doesn't have to be fair, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. Liana, any comments or questions come through on social media?
Yes, and we welcome you to give your thoughts and comments on our live stream happening across Life FM and Rima Facebook page. This is from Christine. How do we deal with the conflict arising from our desire to vote for a party that looks after the vulnerable in society, but at the same time has life-giving values in terms of abortion law reform, euthanasia, drug reform, etc.? Do we just accept that society is secular and therefore focus on housing and income?
To be fair, I think that's a fantastic question, but I'm going to give the panel just a few minutes to perhaps chew that over before we jump straight into that. But do keep those questions coming. A big hi to everybody watching on the live stream. We'll be back with more from the panel in just a moment.
It's interesting, that notion of, Christians being treated unfairly. I think we're like any group. It's like when we call out media for fake news, not that it's us that calls them out. It's like there's journalists that do a great, thorough job of journalism. There's also journalists out there that don't do a thorough job, and people feel ripped off by the way that they were misrepresented in the media. And I think it's no different for us, the actual spectrum of faith. There are people within our faith context that we look at as Christians and go, my God, can you speak to them? Quite literally. Because they have a very loud and public voice. And I think in that as well, what does it mean to be Christians in the public square? From where we sit, we say to be in the public square means the people who are really suffering in the public square, we're with them. We're in solidarity with them. And so when you look at us being with them, you see Jesus. Now, for other people of faith, they decide to stand up on a soapbox and have a big picket sign and, call out the political leaders or call out the moral decline of the nation or some other religion. And that's their prerogative. But I think we must always remember as Christians, the very accusation we feel that might be very personal to us, it's because there's others who represent the same religion as us that are being represented in a different way to those who are calling out Christians.
Exactly. It's just it's like being. And we can't do this at the moment. But if you're overseas and there's this really embarrassing Kiwi backpack, and you think, "Oh gosh, I'll pretend to be Australian just now." Thanks.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now we are still in commercials. We've got about 40 seconds to go. We'll come back with that question. Brook, we'll start with you on that, but also wanting to get your next, mate.
got this one.
20 seconds.
You're next, and
great.
then we'll just bounce
Sounds cool.
some of the thoughts around that one. So we are now 30 seconds from live. I will just hi social media people. Great question, by the way. If you think you can top that one, come on, comment. Facebook.
Oh, I think it's the central dilemma of this.
Yeah.
Well, it is.
Of any election.
Yeah, I'm just a little bit disappointed we got to it so early. We're just building up. Let's just jump in the deep end. Let's go. Okay, we are coming up live. Well, you are with the panel, and a curly question as we went to the break. Liana, could you read that one more time for our panellists? We had certainly some heated discussion in the room. If people watching it on the social media stream, they got a bit of a sneak preview about what's to happen. But
Yeah, right.
if you could do the question one more time.
It's from Christine on one of our Facebook pages. How do we deal with the conflict arising from our desire to vote for a party that looks after the vulnerable in society, but at the same time has life-giving values in terms of abortion law reform, euthanasia, drug reform, etc.? Do we just accept that society is secular and therefore focus on housing and income?
This is a tough one, but during the break, Brook, you had some good things to say on this. If I can paraphrase it here, some parties seem to have a strong social justice policy, but may have views on moral issues that some Christians struggle with. How do we find the balance in amongst all of that, in your view?
In my view, it just comes down to, what weighting and power do you give politics in terms of your faith? And, what we represent as Christian communities, that's where the real change can happen. Now, there's no doubt, we work with whoever the prospective government is, and we have very strong relationships with government across the political spectrum. And I can tell you the politicians that I meet from both sides of the floor, they have good intentions. I have not met a politician on either side that doesn't want what's best for New Zealand. They just have debates about what best looks like, but very good intentioned. I think for voters, you're never going to find a political party that you totally align with. And it's kind of like the church shopper, people going into church and looking for, was the worship right? Did it have the right, children's program for my kids? Do I like the preaching? Is it too long, too short? Is it biblical enough? What do they think on baptism? Do they align with me in terms of my views of the Holy Spirit? It's very difficult to get that alignment with a church, let alone a political party. So what I would say is, what's driving your heart, the hardest at this point in time? Is it something around the environment and the climate? Is it the housing crisis that's facing us? Or is it one of those moral issues that we're voting on the referendum with? And don't be swayed by, other voices. Actually listen to that inner voice of who you're going to vote for, understanding that, there are compromises on both sides.
Yeah. I think everybody in the room, and probably most of the people watching and listening, would say, hey, faith is something which is important to me, and I will factor that in when I vote. Frank, the dilemma is, though, that we have people across the political spectrum who are motivated by faith to do their job. It's not like, this is, if I believe this, then I should vote that. It's a lot more complex than that.
Yeah, it is a lot more complex than that. And on the issues that I know people are thinking about when they ask a question like that, abortion and euthanasia, let's consider for a moment that meth is illegal in New Zealand. We have a big problem with it.
Yeah.
Cannabis is currently illegal in New Zealand. We have a big problem with it. So outlawing something doesn't necessarily solve the problem because, as Brook has pointed out, politics is only one part of the issue in play. So on something like abortion, we could have extremely restrictive laws. We're still going to have a problem because the problem is much bigger than the politics and that moment. The challenge for us as Christians doesn't stop no matter how we vote. So if abortion is a key issue for you, then we need to be thinking about everything that feeds into the issue, not just what the law says. So why is someone standing in an abortion clinic? We need to know the answers to that question so then we can wrap around those people. If someone is considering euthanasia, why why? And if you disagree with euthanasia, what can we as the church be doing to wrap around people and make sure that they're not choosing that as a solution to their end of life? The challenge doesn't stop, and it almost, for the church, doesn't matter what the law says. It does to a degree, but the challenge is on for us to promote human life and flourishing no matter what the law says.
You're not advocating for people to who cares about the... No, we're not going there. That's good. Chris, your thoughts on this one, because, again, back to the research, there is a certain... list of topics which people associate with a Christian worldview, and we've mentioned a few of them. We've got end-of-life choice, we've got abortion, we've got issues to do with sexuality. These are touch points for certainly the perception of what's important to Christians, but again, it's not just a 5-issue race.
Well, that's the point, and in many ways, in the Christian community, you have the same spectrum of views as you have in the political community, from, if you like, from the left to the right. So, when I was working at World Vision, our focus wasn't on issues of personal morality. Our focus was on the fact that there were 65 million refugees who didn't have a home. Yeah. Our focus was on the fact of inequality, and that your postcode largely determined your economic, social and cultural outcomes, and that was wrong. So if you like, we were focusing on the big meta story and standing with the poor, standing with the marginalised, and seeking to reflect Christ into those communities. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got people who are very convinced that the right faith expression is about personal morality. It's where I stand on abortion and so on. Now, the point is that it's not either or. It's how do we embrace both? And I wonder, I love Christine's question, because I think the reality is there is never a good accommodation between faith and politics. At its best, there will be a queasiness. And in fact, at its worst, it's when faith and politics align, because actually that happened historically and we ended up killing people. So in a sense, there'll always be a queasiness. Now, why is that? That is because actually, as Christians, we believe that truth matters. Yes. And in that sense, that truth is inviolate. Politics is the nature of compromise and managing the fact that across a community there'll be all sorts of different views. So how do you manage different truths? As Christians, we will always struggle with living in that environment, and that's okay.
We'll come back to some of the points you made in just a moment, but Brook, just wanting to pick up with you on this whole idea of separation in church and state. Now, politically, this is an American ideal, but a lot of people are quite keen for that to happen, particularly people coming from a secular point of view, wanting to make sure that church and state are separate, that the church, that the Christians, that weird lot of God-botherers, don't have an undue influence in the operation of government. Now, for you personally, as you mentioned, you are working alongside the government of the day, including using taxpayer funds for some of your programs. Is there a dilemma or even a compromise in that for you and the team?
I don't think there's a compromise as such. I think that if you look at the work that happens in New Zealand to deal with the issues that Chris was just talking about in terms of inequality, poverty, homelessness, it's largely driven by a faith ethic, faith-based organisations in New Zealand that have a rich history of putting the poor first, and actually going and walking with the poor and learning about what their needs are and how we might uplift them. And look, in terms of being an advocate for that, that's what we're advocating to government. We're advocating, hey, we're walking with these. I was speaking to a journalist just before coming in here today about the plight of young people in housing in New Zealand right now, and that we do not have a youth housing strategy and young people miss out. And for me as a Christian, when I speak to a politician about that, I am speaking from a very strong faith ethic that there is nothing in the language of church or churchisms in the way that I speak. No. And I think a thing to remember too that's really important that I do want to get across to your question is Christians are people. We are not an institution. Jesus didn't come to set up an institution. He came to set up a revolution of people. And so people's influence in the political world in terms of faith influence is important, but institutional influence, I think that goes down the track that Chris was talking about.
But you're
before.
not needing to perhaps talk down the Christian faith aspect in order to get the government contracts. There's no compromise there from your point of view.
No, I don't think so. And I think actually, without sounding trite, I think that's a small charity perspective. Okay. I think for the larger, more influenced charities that have faith. I mean, the Prime Minister meets with the New Zealand Council of Christian Social Services once a year. In moments of crisis, previous prime ministers of previous governments have called leaders of faith-led charities in New Zealand and said, how do we deal with this? What happens behind the scenes looks very different to what sometimes we have a perception of in the halls of Parliament.
Again,
and what we see
that
on our TV.
relationship, that trust, that the conversations are possible in that scenario. Chris, just wanting to throw a curly one your way. Well, you've had an easy ride so far, so let's try this one. A sizable percentage of the population are Christian. As you said, there's a third of the population. If the Christians all voted as a bloc, then a faith-based party could hold the balance of power. In your view, is this likely, and would it be a good thing?
It would be a terrible thing, and it will never happen. There's been plenty of examples of faith-based parties that have tried to get up and tried to capture the imagination. To do that, they've usually had to campaign on a single issue, and usually it's been around some aspect of private morality. The difficulty with that is that if you're in government, you're not just worried about private morality issues. You've got to think about things, regulation, licensing, education curricula. How do we improve the health of communities? This vast array of topics. You've got to think about all of them.
Yep.
And so it's a real challenge for Christian parties who campaign on a single issue. That's why I don't think it will ever happen. But further, I don't ever think we'll see a consensus among Christian groups that say, yeah, this one group represents all that I stand for and believe in. And frankly, I think that'd be a terrible kind of thing because that is coercive and it's an abuse of power. And I think it is the antithesis of what Jesus was about.
Now, there are a number of smaller parties who claim to be coming from a Christian worldview, and yet they disagree on some of their key policy areas and refuse to work together. Frank, that's the story of the church for the last couple of thousand years, right?
Yeah, and it's part of our problem, but it's also part of our beauty. There's this film called The Body. It stars Antonio Banderas. And the premise of the film is that the tomb of Jesus and the body of Jesus may have been found, which of course would make Christianity come crashing down. So he's sent by the Vatican to effectively determine that it's not. But there's this wonderful scene where a piece of pottery is stolen from the tomb, and he turns up. He works out that it was the local synagogue that took it, and Antonio Banderas, as this Catholic priest, turns up at the synagogue, and all these men are sitting around arguing over this one piece of scripture, and they're going at it, and it looks chaotic, but there's beauty in there as well as we listen to each other, and we push our own view forward, and we learn from one another. So that communal voice of the church is where traditionally we've always placed the authority of the church, is in its communal voice, but we can't get a communal voice unless we're willing to disagree, have a little bit of conflict. But when it gets violent, we have a problem.
Well, that is also a wonderful picture of politics. We each have a voice. We each have the opportunity to have our say in what a civil society looks like. All faiths and none come to the table as an equal person. Now, Liana, I don't think we're going to get consensus on this one. These guys aren't going to tell us which party to vote for. I've done my best on this one. However, a question for each of you just before we go to the break. If the scenario is that your local MP was a Christian and had faith views similar to your own, would that be a big influence on whether or not you voted for them, regardless of their party? Frank, starting with you.
Yeah, it would. And the second part of that, whether they have a faith or not doesn't actually matter too much to me, because someone can declare a faith and do a horrible job in politics. But that second part, does their worldview somewhat align to my own? Yes, that would have an influence no matter what party they were with.
And Brook, your comments on that? Your local MP is a Christian. Are they likely to get your local vote more or less because of their faith?
Not because of their faith, no. It would be an alignment of the New Zealand I want to see and the closest alignment to a local MP, and also not just in terms of the nation I want to see, but in my electorate and what's actually happening and what the concerns in my neighbourhood is. And I think there is a need for a rise of a greater neighbourhood consciousness in New Zealand for how we actually live together in neighbourhoods.
Who's doing the best job for the local people that I live with? Yeah,
exactly.
Chris, any comments on that before we go to the break?
Well, it's the one joy of MMP, which is that you can actually vote with one vote for the party you want to lead the nation, but then you've got a second vote which has an incredibly sort of localised aspect to it, which is delightful. For me, the fact that the person was a Christian wouldn't be determinative, but what I'd be looking for is a consistency of character and a track record of performance. Now, there are often indicators of true Christian heart. That's probably for me more important. But I would hold the point that just because somebody is a Christian doesn't presume that everybody else doesn't have something to do with the story, because we believe in a common grace. We believe that everybody is made in the image of God, and thus everybody has an inkling of the sense of what God is trying to do in this world.
Yeah, and we've got some terrible examples of people who claim to be Christians and turned out to be terrible politicians.
Right.
Liana, I'm not asking you who you're going to vote for. That's between you and Jesus. But in that issue, if your local, if there was a local candidate in your electorate who went to the same church as you, and you thought, hey, this person, I can relate to them at a faith level, is that going to influence your vote?
I don't think so, because I have met a ton of people who don't claim to be Christians, yet their values and the way they live their life and what they're doing in the community can speak louder than someone just saying, I'm a Christian, I've got faith in Jesus, which is great. That's awesome. But what are the fruits of your life, and what are you actually doing, putting your faith into action in your community or in your life? Like, for me, that's more important than just calling yourself a Christian.
No, very good indeed. Any more questions just before we go to the break?
There are questions, and I'm not sure if they could be answered quite quickly, so maybe ones to think about. There's lots of questions coming through, so feel free to join the people on our live stream over Life FM and Rema Facebook page. How is it balanced in Parliament, this is from Isaac, in terms of including practices of different religions? If they are praying to the Christian God, logically, shouldn't they also pray to Allah, since Muslims make up a percentage of the population?
Okay, well, I mean, in a post-Christian world where Christianity perhaps isn't the dominant influence that it once was, an interesting question. And Liana, I think we're probably not going to get a chance to go to all of these questions, but that's one of the wonderful things about social media. Questions that aren't answered as a community, share them, be nice to each other, be polite, but let's have a civil conversation online. That's vaguely possible theoretically, isn't it, Frank?
Vaguely possible.
Civil conversations online about this very important topic. We'll be back with more in just a moment. Well, there we go. That was fun, wasn't it?
Good work.
Yeah.
That's good.
Great.
Nice stuff.
So we, hi people on social media, and again, be nice to each other, but keep the conversations
You
happening.
framed it brilliantly. You just made it so easy for the rest of us to kind of...
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, seriously, you did all the heavy lifting and everyone else did, like he said. Yeah. You were the one that went out and they went, oh, yeah, I liked his idea.
Peter Rollins has this parable, I don't know if you guys have heard it, about the two rabbi that are sitting in Central Park arguing over the Torah, and they're arguing over this piece, and they go and meet every week, and they're arguing over the same piece of scripture for 20 years. Finally, one of the angels in heaven goes, hey, God, can you just go tell them what you intended by this piece of the scriptures? He's like, 20 years is too long for anyone to argue over one single verse. So God rocks up in this park, comes across these two rabbi and goes, hey, listen, guys, you've been arguing for 20 years on this piece of scripture. This is what I meant. For the first time in 20 years, these two rabbi fully unify together, turn to God and say, who are you to say what the scripture is?
Oh, wow.
That's a nice...
And hey, people watching the live stream get the jokes. The people that are doing, that's a bonus for you guys. Okay, thank you for that. We might not have time for the joke in amongst the last segment, but we are nearly 11:45, so we are on schedule, which is a miracle. Thank you for helping in that regard, but still, a whole bunch of stuff that we're wanting to cover. Chris, we'll jump to you for the first one in response to Liana's question about the sort of the multi-faith perspective and how we respect the faith of others as we practice our own faith. And then, here we go. You are with the panel, Andrew Urquhart and Liana Cooper hosting the show. This is the first time for you, Liana. I think you're doing very well indeed. Lots of questions coming through.
Oh,
you having
heaps of
fun?
Questions. Oh, absolutely. I'm honoured to be a part of this conversation. What a great topic to be a part of, faith and politics. How do you even put the two together?
Well, that's part of the problem, really, isn't it? And had a great question, not about faith and politics, but faiths and politics. Just before the break, could you read that one again?
Yes, absolutely. So this is from Isaac on our Facebook pages. Feel free to ask a question up there. How is it balanced in Parliament in terms of including practices of different religions? If they are praying to the Christian God, logically, shouldn't they also be praying to Allah, since Muslims make up a percentage of the population?
Now, Chris, I don't want to go to a theologian on this one because we could be here for most of the afternoon. But from a practical point of view, now with your work with World Vision, you were helping the poor regardless of their religious affiliation. We are, I mean, as you mentioned in your research, we are a multi-faith nation now, more than we've ever been in our history. Does this person have a point?
I think the point's a really good point, and it goes back to the thought of, first of all, who are we as people? And we're not first defined by being Christian or Muslim or Hindu. We're first defined by the fact that we're made in the image of God.
Yep.
So therefore, we are all equally precious. And I think that's an important lesson for us as Christians. And if I'm seeing a shift in the political engagement between thoughtful Christians and the state, it is a move from adopting a position as the opening stance, I believe in the following things, to adopting a posture. Now, we know very clearly what New Zealanders value as a posture, and it is thoughtfulness, and it's a tolerance and an openness to ideas. So at a personal level, I'm not at all uncomfortable about Parliament having a Muslim prayer. And I don't think God is particularly uncomfortable about it, because one of the things I also notice is that as many Christians seem to me to lack an enormous amount of confidence in God, and they sort of feel they need to sort of help him out. And so the way we'll help him out is by making sure that absolutely nobody else gets into the conversation. I think God can cope.
He's big enough to cope with this one. Now, I mean, faith is something which has motivated many people over the years politically, not just Christians. I mean, William Wilberforce, of course, your founder in some ways, Chris, but also people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Mahatma Gandhi as well. Frank, I suppose the example of Dietrich Bonhoeffer is somebody who took a stand when the rest of the Christian community was doing nothing. Is there part of the problem here is if good people do nothing, that's where evil prevails. And actually, maybe as people of faith, we are required by God to take a stand on some of these moral issues. What's your thoughts?
I probably want to jump back in the conversation here, because we've talked about justice and we've talked about morality as if those two things are distinct, and they are not. Climate is a moral issue, it's a justice issue. Those two things can't be pulled apart. If someone is homeless, it's a moral issue. So I think when we're weighting things, there is a certain sector of Christendom that is going, it's the moral issues that are really important. But actually, those things aren't disconnected from talk about climate, homelessness, poverty. I was a child, I grew up in a home that was dependent on the DPB, solo mother. I was educated through social welfare.
Yeah.
I would hope that Christians would see that as really important. I wouldn't be who I am without people valuing that as really, really important. And who knows what I would be if I hadn't had that in place. Maybe some of those other issues that Christians are deeming to be important would be a big part of my life.
Yeah.
But because some people saw that as important, it's played a significant part in my life. So morality is hugely important in our politics, but this is all moral.
When it comes to voting, of course, we're not telling people who to vote for, but very much encouraging people to vote. Now, Liana, I know you haven't taken that step. You haven't exercised your democratic right and responsibility yet. No. You're planning on doing so, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to get in early, too.
Exactly. Anybody else in the room not voted yet? Well, gosh.
I'm all about the day.
Well, all about the day. Well,
okay.
Okay, well, that's fair enough. But actually, one thing I would say is definitely make sure that you vote, because if you don't vote, you can't blame the government, right?
Oh, look, it's an occasion. You're absolutely right. I've spent a lot of time in parts of the world where you cannot vote. And I've been in countries which have had their first election. And it's the most extraordinary thing to see queues, hundreds, thousands deep, of people actually voting for the first time. So we must absolutely vote. We make it an occasion for that very reason. So Saturday morning, we're going to vote. Then we'll go and have a cup of coffee. And we'll actually celebrate the fact that we're in a democracy where we can vote. And also where the voting station is only 100 metres from our home. I don't have to travel interstate to vote.
Well, that's very good stuff indeed. And yeah, not wanting to take that for granted. However, there's a little bit of a trap, because we're talking here about who are the best people to be our leaders. And Brook, your comments on this, I mean, faith is something which motivates you to do what you do in the community, and you do so in partnership with government. But it's easy perhaps to blame the government for this policy or this piece of legislation. Perhaps much better to say, okay, what are the problems in our community? What are the problems in our society? What is God calling me to do in answer to some of those issues, rather than just saying, oh, I voted once, now it's the government's problem?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that voting is like a billboard of citizenship. You know, it's this moment that happens every 3 years where you're reminded, I'm a citizen of this country. I've got a right to vote. Now, my eldest daughter is 12. I had her at a political panel at a university hostel with me last week because she's very, very energised about the political discourse that's happening and, doing surveys in her group. She's like, Dad, if I could have one policy, it's that we'd lower the voting age to 16, and that's because of climate. And, and I think, I want to raise a family, I want to raise a household that are citizens and that understand that in our daily behaviour, we are all contributing to it. We are all contributing to it. Don't think about the speculative housing market as something that you're somehow separate from.
Yep.
You're not. Your capital gain on your property, your investment properties contribute to that. Don't think that you're separate to the racial segregation we've got in Auckland through our schooling system. The way the zones have been created with the decile system has led to that. We're all a part of that. That's not some politician that did that. That's human behaviour. That's us as a group, as a mob, going a particular way in a particular direction as a country. And so when we vote, it makes us sit back and go, oh my gosh, are we there?
Yeah.
Are these really the issues? Oh, and maybe it wakes us up a little bit and we're like, far out, what's going on here? Or maybe for some of us, we're like, why on earth are these other policies not here? Why aren't they front and centre? And so I think that's really important. So when we vote, I'd encourage people out there, when you vote, take the people in your family who aren't of a voting age to vote. Now, I talked about my one eldest daughter before. I took my youngest daughter to the voting booth to vote with me.
Okay.
And she was asking me about all the questions. I think that's important too. The education around the place this has in citizenship, but it's not I'm a citizen because I vote. It's I'm a citizen, and part of being a citizen is voting every 3 years.
No, very, very well answered there, and I'm sure your daughter will make a great politician on that one. I'm not sure about you, though, because you were saying it's everybody's fault. So, I mean, that's not a great political line if you want people to like you, just saying.
Activist.
Now, Frank, your thoughts on this? Because, look, we're not going to solve this before 12 midday, but some people think, look, it's impossible to find a political party that represents me. Yes. What's the point? What's the point? I can't find somebody whose box I can tick with a clear conscience. Why should I even engage with the political process? What's your answer to that person?
Yeah, you should never find a political party that completely aligns with you. If you have, then it comes back to what Chris talked about earlier, and that alignment of our faith with power. There should always be that sense of queasiness.
Yep.
I think one of the problems that we've fallen into, you mentioned Dietrich Bonhoeffer earlier, his overarching ethic was that the problem of humanity is that we ate from the tree of good and evil. And ever since then, we've put God aside and we've tried to work out what's good and what's bad, and how do I align myself with the good without really thinking about God in that mix. We do that ourselves.
Yep.
Dietrich Bonhoeffer would say that the first call of the Christian is to be close to the heart of God, to be steeped in God, so that every decision that we make it comes from that impulse. So when you're faced with a situation, and for Bonhoeffer it was, do I get involved in the plot to assassinate Hitler, even though he'd started out as a pacifist?
Yep.
There is no great answer to that question. You just dive in.
Yep.
You just dive in to get some of the work done. So in politics, it's never going to be perfect, but we dive in anyway.
And look, we may not, knowledge of good and evil, we may not have the perfect solution, but we do need to make a choice. We do need to tick one box and not another when it comes to our voting experience. We can't sit on the fence on this one, Chris.
Oh, look, it's a little bit like parenting. Friends who have thought about having children saying, oh, it's so messy and so noisy and it'll compromise my career, and why would I ever want to do something like that? You can take the same kind of approach to voting. Oh, it's messy and I don't know if it quite agrees with me. But if you opt out of that, what you are missing out on is something quite extraordinary. In a very small way, you are making a contribution to making this nation better. And that's the power of voting.
Final question, and we'll just do a round of this. All of you, in different ways, have seen the difference that faith, hope and love has made in our communities. We started with the concept, a bit of a bleak picture from you, Chris, about saying, hey, we're not the Christian country that we once were. But for each of you, do you have hope for the future of Aotearoa? Do you have hope for the role that faith will have in our nation? Brook, starting with you.
I absolutely have hope. I think that we have a real opportunity that COVID's afforded us, particularly when we think about climate and what's going to happen over the next decade and what will happen for our children and grandchildren, the fact that we're an island nation at the bottom of the world.
Yeah.
that affords us some advantages to some other nations around the world in respect to some of the global issues. And so I think New Zealand's got a real chance to punch above our weight, like we do so in so many other areas, but in the areas that count, in, looking for a more equitable way of distributing what we have so that all New Zealanders can thrive, and that we don't have, 1 in 5 New Zealanders in food insecure homes during COVID, to have a nation where, we can be green and the economy can still thrive.
Brook, I'm almost regretting asking you first because everyone's just going to say, like he said, but no cop-outs on this one. Chris, your thoughts, hope for the future of our nation and with faith as a part of that.
Oh, yes, and for 2 reasons. First of all, we know the meta story, the big story. And it was that God created this world, and it was very good. We also know at the very end of Revelation there'll be no more tears, there'll be no more war, there'll be no more sadness. We live in the messy muddle between those 2 big chapters of Scripture. So it's not surprising that at times it's really, really hard. But what gives me hope? First of all, that we know that God is in control of the story. And secondly, this generation of young people that are growing up in Aotearoa, I'm seeing in them a different posture to so many issues that I ignored, frankly, in terms of pursuit of my own interests, but they have a much bigger global sense. And that, I think, picking up on Brook's point, is what COVID has shown us, is that we couldn't have responded to COVID if we'd highly individualised ourselves. That point about the team of 5 million really matters, but here's the risk. The big risk is that we follow so many other nations around the world and we tribalize. In other words, we say, my tribe is more important than your tribe. And we lose that sense that we're part of a wider society and part of a wider community. And that's the art of politics.
Tough act to follow, but this role is yours. Frank, final words on that topic just before we head to news.
Yeah, ultimately, God's got this. Both these gentlemen have reflected that. God's got this. I truly believe that. And God, in terms of faith, the church is God's, and He's got this. But I also see the posture shift that's going on with the church in New Zealand to really grappling with what it means to love, serve, and bless the community around us, even when we disagree. When we really adopt that, the culture around us responds. And here I want to honour the Muslim community of Christchurch. I interviewed a TVNZ reporter who was one of the first on the scene, and she was quite significantly struck by the part their religion had played in how they responded in terms of their healing, their ability to forgive, express love, and move on. She was struck by that. When we embody those things, it speaks to the intrinsic part of who we are as human beings. When we can stop defending ourselves and think that we need to defend who God is and what it is that we're up to, and just love, bless, and serve, the community will respond. So faith has a significant part, and again, God's got this.
Hey, you gentlemen, thank you so much for all of your contributions. Certainly some food for thought, Liana. Lots of people wanting to get their questions on Facebook, but we are out of time. Let's keep the conversations happening. Make sure you do vote. Thank you for being part of the program. And do make sure that you exercise your political right and duty. Thanks for joining us.